Well done. Your lords and masters.
Hello and welcome to day 4 of the Genesis of Androzani Advent Calendar for 2020. Today we have a big old video. This one is a ranking and it's going to be quite a long one. Well, of sorts. It's quite long, decently long. And what I'm going to be doing is I am going to be ranking the first 50 main range Big Finish audios. So this is everything from, I believe it's 1999 up to 2003 on the 40th anniversary. This is going to be a big one. So obviously, if you haven't listened to these audios, there might be some spoilers. I'll try not to keep it too spoilery, but to talk about them properly, I'm going to have to spoil them to some extent. So just be aware of that. And also just be aware that this is just my opinion. So if you've got your own opinions on these audios, then obviously feel free to let us know in the comments or on Twitter or whatever. But yes, this is going to be a big one because I, earlier this year, listened to all 50 of the first 50 main range Big Finish audios, which are free to listen to on Spotify if you have Spotify. So that is handy. But this is often regarded as the golden era of Big Finish, in a way. So it's quite a popular time period for them, being the first 50. It's in the very early stages before New Who returned, when Big Finish was kind of the primary outlet for Doctor Who. So, yeah, this will be very interesting. Alrighty, so with that said, let's begin in the ranking from 50 to 1 of the first 50 Doctor Who Big Finish main range audios. So, I overall am very positive on this set of stories, the first 50, as most people seem to be from what I hear. But there are a few at the bottom that do stick out a bit. However, what I will say is, most of the ones that stick out at the bottom, I wouldn't say are absolutely terrible. Most of them are below average in the sort of bottom tier of the first 50. But there is one story at the very bottom at number 50 that is by far the worst of the first 50 and is the worst Big Finish audio I've ever heard. And it's one of the worst Doctor Who stories of all time for me. And that is Necromantia. This story was so bad that Peter Davison made sure that the writer of this story was fired and would never write for Big Finish again. Otherwise, Peter Davison would not take part in Big Finish. Yes, it was that bad. Necromantia is awful. It is awful on almost every level. It is, in a lot of ways, feels like what some edgy troll teenager would do if they wrote a Doctor Who story. It is dark and edgy, but it's all in a surface level and distasteful way. I mean, the most infamous thing about this story that most people will tell you is there is a scene where one of the companions it's implied that they're raped, sexually assaulted, and yet not only does the story brush this off, but it almost presents it like it's good, which is really questionable. In fact, it's not just questionable, it's wrong, in my opinion, and hopefully all of yours. This story is just, it's so boring, and all the characters in it are terrible, the pacing's terrible, the idea that it has is not realized in any positive way, it's wasted. It even has a bit in the story where the Doctor dies and goes to the afterlife and then comes back, it's solved in a rushed way with a Deus Ex Machina. It's all the sins in one story. And it's fucking awful. It's so bad. And there is not any story above this on this list I think comes even close to being as bad as Necromantia. It is the absolute worst Big Finish of the first 50, and in fact the worst I've heard of any Big Finish. And, you know, if I was to rank it even amongst all Doctor Who that I've witnessed, that includes Big Finish and the TV show, it's right down there with, you know, the likes of Hellbent and Kill the Moon and Timeless Children. It's fucking terrible. It is so bad. Oh. And I would be pretty happy to never listen to it again. Number 49. Now this one I don't like either, but thankfully it's nowhere near as bad as Necromantia, so we are moving into the sort of more respectable bad, if that makes sense. Ugh. Anyway, my number 49 is The Sandman. So my biggest problem with The Sandman is that it has an interesting premise. This is sort of functions in the way of the Doctor was wrong, is essentially the kind of angle it's taking, although it's sort of trying to lean in this more grey area. But the whole idea of it is that the Doctor made mistakes that caused a civilization to be the way they are. And Evelyn Smythe, because obviously this is a Sixth Doctor story with Evelyn, she obviously doesn't approve of this at all. She's really not happy about it. And the way it executes this idea, it's a little bit far-fetched for me, and it doesn't really work in the way that I would want it to at first, and it's a really jarring, odd angle to take a story like this. But the worst thing about it is that not only does it do that, and then Evelyn becomes a non-factor in the story for a lot of it afterwards, which is a strange choice, considering that giving her conflict with the Doctor in this scenario would have been an interesting way to go into some character drama. Instead, it spends the rest of the story on this just tedious, awful, boring filler. And the voices for the Galliari in this story are just so painful to listen to. And even Colin Baker towards the second half doesn't even sound like he's into it, which is rare because Colin Baker almost puts everything he has into all stories that he's in. But yeah, I didn't like this one at all. I thought it was really below average and wasted an interesting concept and became tedious and just hard to listen to. Yeah, The Sandman, don't like it. Number 49. Number 48. The Time of the Daleks. So this is obviously the fourth installment in the Dalek Empire quadrilogy that spanned across the four Doctors doing Big Finish at the time. This one is obviously the Paul McGann story of this. And what we get in this story is it's essentially one of the concepts from The Evil of the Daleks, the Troughton story, is the Daleks, traveling through time and through these mirrors. And what it does is it takes that concept from Evil of the Daleks and turns it into this story. It becomes its own story. But unfortunately, because of that, it just becomes this really generic runaround filler. And it's just not fun to listen to for me. It's just real tedious, and there's not much substance to it, not much character work. It's a very heavy action-oriented story, but it's not one that really inspires much variety. It's very repetitive. I suppose the Daleks quoting Shakespeare is interesting, but yeah, it's a really generic story that it's played out, and it uses its concept in quite a boring way, and it's so long. It's really long, and it just doesn't work. It's not very good. My number 47 is Sword of Orion. Now, I believe, if I'm correct, I'm pretty sure this was the first ever Big Finish I ever listened to, because I remember going on the website and seeing that it was free. And so I downloaded the app and I got Sword of Orion, and I listened to it overnight and I fell asleep because it was so boring. And then recently I went to listen to it again, and I just remember it's especially a shame considering it's the second story for the Eighth Doctor and Charlie, but the way they characterized just wasn't endearing, and it didn't really follow up Storm Warning in a way that it should have, and it's just really sluggish, non-interesting, uninspired Cyberman action schlock, but it's not really that entertaining. It's quite dull, and it's just not very good. It's kind of the definition of mediocre, I would say, and it's quite an overrated story, to be honest, because Big Finish big it up about, it's the first Cyberman story on Big Finish, and it's the first time the Eighth Doctor met the Cyberman, and it's, it's written by Nick Briggs, but it's just, it's a bit like Time of the Daleks, where it just doesn't do anything for me. It's really mediocre. My number 46 is Red Dawn. This one's kind of, again, a bit like in the same category as Time of the Daleks and Sword of Orion, whereas this one is with the Fifth Doctor and the Ice Warriors, and obviously Perry is also in this story. And again, it's just, I think one of the biggest issues with this one is this is the first one that Davison and Nicola Bryant did together on Big Finish, and if I'm correct, I believe that when they worked together on the TV show, Davison didn't take to Nicola Bryant too well, and then they came back here, and there was still a bit of tension over that. Of course, I believe once after this audio and they started to get to know each other a bit better, things started to mellow, and Peter Davison became much more fond of her, which is good. But yeah, this one is the anti-chemistry between the Fifth Doctor and Perry. It kind of clashes a little bit, which is weird though, because they work brilliantly in the case of Androzani, but here it is just didn't work quite well enough. And also, I think part of the reason why there's a slight disconnect is I believe that audios are much better off, at least from what I've heard, once Eirich comes into the fold, they become a three-piece, whereas here it's just them together, and it's just a bit mediocre. It's a mediocre Ice Warriors story that I just don't warm to at all. It kind of had that Power of Kroll effect where it just sort of teetered off and became nothing. And I don't really like it. Number 45, The Dark Flame. Yes, The Dark Flame comes up here, which is a 7th Doctor story, and I believe it's the first 7th Doctor story on this list. Yes, it is. My biggest positive to this story is the sound design. I do like the sound design, and on a production level it's all well done, the actors are fine, everything is well put together, you've got all the characters and everything in there. They don't mess up at all when it comes to that, and everyone that was working on it was really good. The only thing that's wrong with it for me is the writing, and the reason why is that this is so generic. It is exactly what you would expect when you think of, a story about an old force from ancient times has reawakened, and it will be taking you all over, and you will be under the control of the Dark Flame. It's like that sort of thing, and it's just, it got really tiresome and really tedious. The amount of times that characters would say, "The Dark Flame, the Dark Flame, the Dark Flame," and I just couldn't get into it. It does have a cool cover, and again, like I said, the sound design's really cool, but the story is just nothing. It's just tedious and boring and not very good. A bit like the ones a few below them. And again, the reason why I rank them above them is because of the sound design and the way it's made. It is very well produced, but again, just not endearing at all. Number 44. Whispers of Terror. Now, I'm not sure if this is a hot take or not. I've heard mixed reviews of the Whispers of Terror, but the way that I see this story is it kind of is exactly what you would expect. When you've got Big Finish becoming a thing and audio stories becoming a thing, someone would think, well, what's a good concept that we can do for an audio story? And someone says, well, why don't we make the villain work via sound? because obviously it's a sound format. Except, the thing is, there is another story that's not on this list because it was after 50 called Scherzo by Rob Sherman that is my favourite Big Finish of all time, that has a villain that functions on sound, and it is absolutely exquisite and beautiful and just brilliant on every level and touches me emotionally even. This one though, this is like the warehouse version of that, where it doesn't have any abstract quality to it. It doesn't have that creative drive. It's just a very bog standard story that is based around this concept of sound. And it doesn't really do anything that interesting with it. And I do believe that me listening to Scherzo first definitely would have had a negative impact on Whispers of Terror, because Whispers of Terror is essentially the lesser version of Scherzo in regards to the villain. But the one reason why, because even though I don't really like the story and the plot, to be honest at all, the one reason why I put it slightly above the others is because the chemistry between Colin Baker and Nicola Bryant as the Sixth Doctor and Perry, them bickering with each other is good. I like that. They are enjoyable, but that's about it. I would also say another criticism is that the sound design and the way it's edited in this story it's shaky, it's rough. And that did take away from the experience. I found myself struggling to getting a bit immersed in the story because of Whispers of Terror not being made particularly well. And yeah, that does unfortunately hinder it. Number 43. And this is going to be a hot take. The Land of the Dead. Now, the reason why this is controversial is because most people put this near the bottom. Which, admittedly on this list, I did technically put it low down. I put it in the bottom 10. But most people consider this to probably be the second worst, just above Necromantia. And the argument for that being that people find it extremely boring. Which is fair, because it's not a particularly eventful story, which I will admit. It's not particularly eventful. A lot of what happens in the story is action-based, and you can't really see the action, which is a problem. But I do have a slight soft spot for this story for some reason, and I guess I'm just one of those people. Let me explain. The way I would describe Land of the Dead is it's kind of like when you're on holiday and you turn on the TV and you just want to flick onto some random movie and you're going through the channels, and you just find this really weird horror film in an ice forest somewhere in Alaska, and there's some ancient beast that's been awoken, and it's just, and there's a bunch of strange people in trucks that are gallivanting around this area, and it's just, I don't know, there's something about Land of the Dead that I just like how, the kind of the atmosphere of the whole setting of where it is, and I really like how scientific it is. I like how, the Fifth Doctor in this story, the way he approaches it from a very scientific level. And I just like the way that Davison would, he analysed these bones and why they were forming the shapes of these creatures. And he was fascinated by it. And I loved the explanation of it being that there is this force that is holding these bones together. And essentially it is a force that was holding these creatures together as they were. But the creatures got so hungry and so just unbelievably starving to feed themselves that they ended up eating their own flesh. And yet they still stand as these big bone monsters. I just thought that was really cool. I feel like this episode, to me, it felt a bit like if the Doctor was David Attenborough. And it was really cool. It was really interesting for that. And there's also a nice little subplot with Nissa being taken away in a car. And I know, I'll admit, it's not nowhere near, great. It's not even probably good. And I can see why people would find this story quite boring. But I don't know, I found it like a sort of soothing experience. I found it was like, I was listening to a scientist talk about some wild area that we didn't know, and it uncovered some ancient threat, and I thought it was cool. I thought it was alright, you know? A bit uneventful, a bit... The action scenes don't really work because you can't really see them, but I don't know, I didn't hate it, I didn't think it was that boring. I thought it was just fine. I thought it was just whatever. So, yeah, that's my controversial opinion. Land of the Dead, not that bad. Number 42, Loup-Garou, by Mark Platt, who wrote Ghostlight, and I believe he also wrote many other great stories like Spare Parts and Lung Barrow and all that. This is probably the one that I need to re-listen to the most on this list, because the reason why it ends up quite low is because I don't think I really got it, which seems to be a slight thing with some people with Mark Platt stories. I know that there are a lot of people that were confused by Ghostlight, and I wasn't. I actually really liked Ghostlight. This one, though, I was sort of struggling to sort of wrap my head around it, and I think maybe the audio format was a part of it. I recall there being some really good performances. I remember the Fifth Doctor and Turlough being a good fit for the story in terms of the characters. And I liked the setting and the sound and the whole thing with the train and all the abstract themes and whatnot. And I've heard people talk about the story, and I like the ideas that are put on paper, but for some reason, as a listening experience, I just can't get into this one. But I definitely think it'll be worth a re-listen. I'm hoping that someday I can reappraise the story and try and dig up what the real big hype around it is, because I was left very lukewarm and unsure on this one. But it wasn't bad at all. It wasn't a bad story. It was just I was a bit puzzled. That's what I'll say. I was a bit puzzled, which is why it ends up here. But I think out of all the stories on this list, I think this one could move, given the right circumstances. If I can get to grips on Loup-Garou, I might rank it a lot higher. You never know. But I can't quite figure out what it is with this one. Number 41, The Church and the Crown. A pure historical featuring the Fifth Doctor, Peri and Erimem. And it's fine. It's decent. I thought it was a fine story. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. I just thought it was decent. I think maybe there was something about this one that didn't quite appeal to my taste. There are a lot of pure historicals that I really like, especially in the Hartnell era. But this one, I just sort of thought, maybe this one just isn't for me. I couldn't quite sink my teeth into it properly. But yeah, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure about this one, but I thought it was decent. There was an interesting plot, there was interesting characters, the soundscape around it, and with, hearing, sort of creating the world in my head was cool, but the plot itself just didn't interest me that much, but I don't have anything overly against it. Maybe a bit boring, but yeah, I thought it was fine, and that's about it, really. Number 40. Now this one is another slightly controversial opinion, depending on which side of the coin you end up on. My number 40 is Ish. I've heard a lot of people say they love this. I've heard a lot of people say they hate this. It's quite a divisive story. And this one ends up in the middle for me, because this story is kind of the definition of, putting away my personal opinion aside, it's really well acted, really well written, really well directed, everything about it on a production level, a concept level, and in terms of execution level is done extremely well. For what the story wants to be, it does it. And for that I can praise it. Unfortunately, where it fails is my personal enjoyment of it, because the subject matter of this episode is the dictionary. And it's a murder mystery about the dictionary, but I just can't get into it. I just feel like this is a story that is written for people that have an interest in this very specific corner of literature, and I just don't. I don't care. And I felt like the best way for me to put this is that when I was listening to Ish, the person who was writing the script, he sounded like one of those people that loves to correct you on words and is all obsessed with vocabulary. And I know that that was kind of a thing with the Sixth Doctor's era, but it was with the Sixth Doctor, it was like, it was done every now and then for a bit of smug comedic relief, him correcting Peri and being all smarmy. But with this, they turn it into an entire story, and that's just a bit too much for me. I can't get into it. I don't like this one. But again, I'll give it credit for executing its idea to its effect, but it's just not for me. Number 39, The Sirens of Time. The first ever Big Finish audio. This one is a multi-doctor story with 5, 6, and 7. And the first 3 episodes are dedicated to one of each doctor, and then the last one is when they all come together. And it's kind of exactly what you'd expect. It's very safe, and it's fine, and it has some of the rough qualities of early Big Finish. And the actors who play the doctors are really good in it, especially Colin. He was booming in this one. And the plot ends in exactly the way you'd expect. It's fine. It's just fine. And it's a nice little starting point. You know, it's a nice, easy story to listen to get yourself into Big Finish if it's your first time. And it's kind of exactly what you expect it to be. You know, it's kind of delivers exactly the kind of goal that they would want for this first story. And it's just, again, it's fine. And that's all I've got to say about it. It's just fine. Pretty much, I mean, it's enjoyable. I would say I enjoyed it, but it's not one that I really go back to because there's not much you can get out of it after your first viewing, I would say. Number 38, Invaders from Mars. A Mark Gatiss pastiche 8th Doctor story, which is a pastiche of War of the Worlds, being broadcast in 1938, and essentially it goes on the plot of if War of the Worlds was a Doctor Who story. It hardly has any depth to it. It's very surface level, and it has the typical thing of a whole bunch of side characters just randomly die, and it's exactly what you think from Mark Gatiss pastiche. Yeah, very surface level, no depth, but it runs on the whole thing of War of the Worlds in 1938 in a Doctor Who story, and it's just that. It's kind of exactly what you'd expect. It's this little story by Mark Gatiss, and that's what you get. And that's why it ends up on this level of the list, because of the quality of it sort of being around this range intentionally, sort of ends up here because of it. Number 37, Phantasmagoria, again by Mark Gatiss. Mark Gatiss sort of has this thing where he intentionally writes stories to be sort of around this level, I think. He loves his little mid-tier pastiches, doesn't he? There's obviously the exceptions. I haven't read Nightshade, but I've heard great things about it. And I love The Young Quiet Dead, obviously, and there's a lot of Mark Gatiss episodes in New Who. There's a few that I really don't like. But typically he sort of aims to be at around this level. He doesn't really have this sort of ambition to add a lot of depth to his stories, which is what a lot of the other Big Finishers in this range do. But Phantasmagoria, again, it is kind of exactly what you expect from Mark Gatiss. This time it's with the 5th Doctor in Turlough, and the plot's good, it's fine, it functions, and like Invaders from Mars, it doesn't have a lot of depth, but it functions in a nice way, and it has sort of, you know, it has what you'd expect, like the typical Mark Gatiss quirks and quips and sort of his traits in the stories that you expect to see from him. They're always a little bit weird, and they're a little bit throwback. He loves his stories that are set in the past. Mark Gatiss wrote Phantasmagoria. Again, it comes right above Invaders from Mars, which really says us a lot about Mark Gatiss' writing style, and it's decent. It's also a nice one to have as the second Big Finish, I think. It sort of makes sense for Mark Gatiss to sort of be the start of where it starts to really build up the intensity of the stories, and I think that works. Number 36, Embrace the Darkness, which is by Nick Briggs, and it is an 8th Doctor and Charlie story. Okay, so this one frustrates me because it has such a brilliant concept. The fact that there is this solar system without light, and they have to live in this darkness. I love that. I think that's so good. And especially working with the format of Big Finish, the fact that it's the visual element of it is low, which means that you only have to imagine small details that are provided to you by the characters and the sound. But it is a brilliant concept. And I think the first the first and second sort of episodes are where the highlights really spring in. I love the cliffhanger where they find someone that says, that they find someone and their eyes are gone. And it's just, it's really chilling. I love the soundscape of this one. But unfortunately, after about halfway, it really runs out of steam, which is sad. Because this concept had so much potential, and it just completely runs out of steam, becomes like filler, and then the ending, the plot is just kind of ruined by the execution of the ending, and it's a real shame. I think because this, to me, Embrace the Darkness could have been a classic if it had been executed to its full potential. But it just seems like Nick Briggs ran out of ideas, and it sort of lost its way, which is why it ended up going all the way down to this point on the list, which is a real shame, because I think Embrace the Darkness could have been near the top of this list if it had really stuck the landing, which unfortunately it just didn't. Number 35, The Mutant Phase. This is the 5th Doctor installment in the Dalek Empire quadrilogy, and I think this one is much better than Time of the Daleks, but not as good as the others. It's enjoyable Dalek schlock. I think there are elements of it that don't quite work. I think it's a bit too long, and it just needed a bit of a trim down, and I think it could have made for a bit of a snappy, Dalek action story, but I think it just drags on a little bit, and there's one particular cliffhanger that's a little bit weirdly executed when the Doctor walks out of a TARDIS. But I think it's fun. I think it's an enjoyable story. I was engaged through it, and I think that, it makes for an enjoyable Dalek story, and it's not bad. But I just, again, it needed to be trimmed down. It's a bit too long, and it's not the most ambitious story ever. It's not the best story ever. It doesn't quite have enough meat in the plot to inspire brilliance, but it's good. It's a good Dalek story, solid, and, I was fine with it. Just needed to be a bit tighter, and it would work a bit better. Number 34, Winter for the Adept. If there's one word I can use to describe this story, it is atmosphere. I love the atmosphere of this one. The wet sound is just the cold and everything, and this one really is where, the 5th Doctor and Nyssa arc really starts to kick into gear, and I just love it. I think this story, in a lot of ways, I think most people, because even though I don't dislike Land of the Dead like most people do, I will admit it has some shortcomings, but most people can seem to agree that this one definitely is the better executed of the two, and it really takes what Land of the Dead really wanted and does it more towards what it should have been, and its atmosphere, its characters, and the plot isn't the best plot ever, but the whole soundscape of the story is so rich and so engrossing that it just becomes this, I would say, audibly delicious story to listen to. And the performances are just really good. And it's just a really nice story that has some really good character work for Nyssa and the 5th Doctor. And overall, it just functions like a well-oiled machine. And I think it's really solid. Really solid story. And I can't speak enough about how beautiful it sounds. Number 33. Now this one is a guilty pleasure. Number 33 is Minuet in Hell. So, I know the story is batshit insane, and it commits some really weird sins, but I just enjoy it so much for how just crazy it is. I mean, Charlie is in a sex cult. This is a story with the Doctor's amnesia with the 8th Doctor, because everyone talks about the 8th Doctor's amnesia. This one is where it gets really annoying. And it has the Brigadier in it. And we don't get a proper scene with the Doctor and the Brigadier until the very last scene. And it's so frustrating. And the villains are so over the top and ridiculous. And just pantomimely American. But for some reason, I just really enjoyed it. It was chaos. It was absolute chaos. It was mad. And it was fun. I wouldn't blame you if you hated it, because it's really weird, but for whatever reason, I just really enjoyed it. It was so chaotic, it was so insane, and it just, I really liked it. So it's a number 33 because of that. Number 32, The Apocalypse Element. This is the 6th Doctor section of the Dalek Empire quadrilogy, and this one is a Dalek invasion on Gallifrey with Romana in it, as well as Evelyn, and it is a really fun action Dalek story on Gallifrey. And in a lot of ways, it's a precursor to the Time War, because again, it's a Dalek invasion of Gallifrey. This one on a much smaller scale and not involving time travel, but it has that Dalek invasion of Gallifrey as the premise. And I think that in a lot of ways, even though they didn't know it at the time, it is like a precursor to the Time War. And I wouldn't be surprised if Davies, off this story, the Time War really became an idea in his head, more so hearing the fact of, what if the Daleks and the Time Lords were to have a war with each other? And I just think that makes it, especially in hindsight, quite an interesting story to listen to. And it's a lot of fun. Dialogue's great. Again, like I said, the 6th Doctor, Romana, and Evelyn are really good in it. And I just thought it was enjoyable. It was an enjoyable story. Number 31, The Eye of the Scorpion. This is a historical in Egypt in 1400 BC, and it is the first story to appear Eirich, who becomes a companion with the 5th Doctor and Perry. I thought this was a really nice one to listen to. It's not great, but it was interesting enough for me, and I think the character work that they used with the 5th Doctor and Perry in this, and Eirich, was good enough for me to lift up the plot. And I think one thing that I really like about this story is that the way the 5th Doctor approaches these old times with a tender sort of, we need to understand them, but not necessarily like them, but realize that because we're time travelers, we need to stay out of their affairs, to not get involved. It's very much a throwback to stuff like the Aztecs, for example. And I just thought it was a really nice historical story. And this one, for me, this one was more appealing to me than The Church and the Crown. And I also do have an interest in ancient Egypt. I think it's a very fascinating time period, and one that Doctor Who needs to go through more. And we haven't really gotten a proper ancient Egypt story in the TV show, because even though they did go to it in the Daleks Master Plan, and obviously you had Nefertiti and dinosaurs on a spaceship, we haven't really gotten a proper one on TV. But it was nice to have an ancient Egypt story in Big Finish to sort of quench that thirst. And yeah, again, like I said, the way that it builds up Eirich as becoming part of the team in this. And I like that they took a character from this time period, from history. It was interesting. It was somewhat unexpected. If you don't know going in that Eirich will be a companion, I think it kind of throws you off a bit, which is good. It's nice to see a surprise companion entry, and I do think Eirich helps the dynamic of the 5th Doctor and Perry a bit. It's a nice little balance together. Yeah, overall, The Eye of the Scorpion was a good story. I liked it. Not great, but it was good, and I enjoyed it. Number 30, Bang Bang a Boom. So, this one is very interesting. It is co-written by Gareth Roberts and Clayton Hickman, and it is really weird. It's a parody of Star Trek, but also a parody of singing talent shows, and it's insane, and it's in the vein of season 24, because obviously it has McCoy and Mel in it, and it's really, really weird. And I also think it has that kind of murder mystery element of something like Terror of the Vervoids, but it does it in such a self-aware pantomime way. And actually, it's interesting that it is written by Gareth Roberts, considering he did Unicorn and the Wasp as well, and this one is just it's just so bizarre. The fact that there's this singing contest going on during a murder mystery on this, Star Trek spaceship, it's just so weird. And the fact that the singing contest has a fucking, was it a mouse or a rat? It's either a mouse or a rat in it. I mean, that's just so weird. I just think the chaos of this one is enjoyable. And it's just, It's a really, it's again, like, I do have a soft spot for Gareth Roberts when he's not writing with James Corden in it, but overall I do have a soft spot for Gareth Roberts' comedy, and I just think it's such a weird story, and it's endearing in that way, but it's just, I sometimes I just, like, scratch my head, like, and I think about, like, how did this story come to be? It's such a weird mashup of different things that you think wouldn't fit, and admittedly, they don't really fit, but that's kind of the point. Yeah, Bang Bang a Boom is fun. It's a fun story, but it's really strange. Number 29, Primeval. Now, this is where we start to get to the really good stuff for me. This is where, from here up, I'm starting to get some, proper passion for these stories. Primeval, in a lot of ways, is like a prequel to Keeper of Traken, except Nyssa and the Doctor are from after Keeper of Traken, so they're time-traveling back to before Keeper of Traken. So it gives some really interesting backstory on Keeper of Traken, so obviously you will have to have seen Keeper of Traken for full context of the story. But if you have, that's really good, because then you get a nice background to Traken, it adds more lore to that whole storyline, the whole fascinating world. I think my favourite thing about this story, Primeval, is the way that it uses the Fifth Doctor and Nyssa as characters, and this is where they really start to become great together on Big Finish. Because I think Davison has said about the TV show is he liked working with Sarah Sutton as Nyssa, but they didn't really get much to do together, whereas here in Big Finish they get a lot more to work with, which is really good. And I really like the moral dilemma that the Doctor goes through and how selfless he is and how he feels responsible for Nyssa being in danger and he's really going out of his way. And it fits so well as a Fifth Doctor story, and again, like I said, really interesting to go to before the Keeper of Traken on Traken, and it's a good story. It's a really good story for the characters, and I really appreciate it for that. So yes, very good, Primeval. Number 28, The One Doctor. This is a story that Adam and I have reviewed on the channel before, and it is a Christmas story, and it is really, really weird, but in sort of the best way. I love the fact that we've had stories like 3 Doctors, the 5 Doctors, the 2 Doctors, even the 4 Doctors in Big Finish. And then we have a multi-Doctor story, called The One Doctor. And I just love that as a whole premise. The fact that they go to this time where the Doctor has become this famous figure, yet it's like this poor imitation of the Doctor. And Colin Baker and Mel end up there. And it's just really cool. It's a really cool idea for a story. Just a funny little story with Colin Baker being like, no, you can't be the Doctor, I am the Doctor. And I just love that. I love that there's a whole fake Doctor and a fake companion, and it plays with some really cool metatextual jokes about the show, and I just love it. And then obviously got Matt Lucas as this big green blob that swallows the Doctor, and it's so weird and funny. It's a really funny story. I think my one big criticism that I gave of it in the review was that the soundscape doesn't quite work, because I can't really imagine the setting that well. It doesn't really do that particularly greatly, but as a comedy story, it's a lot of fun, and I enjoy it. I really enjoy The One Doctor. Number 27, Dust Breeding. This is the first Big Finish story to feature the Master, and we get Geoffrey Beevers to return. I believe that this story was originally written with Anthony Ainley in mind, but he declined, but I still think it works well with Beevers. And this story also has some really interesting concepts and a really good soundscape. One thing I actually really like about it that is interesting how it draws some parallels to the painting from the 50th anniversary Day of the Doctor, in the sense of that concept being in the story in some ways. But I just really like the plot. I thought that Geoffrey Beevers was fantastic, and I love the scenes that he has with McCoy. And yeah, it's just a really, really solid story. I think there were some stories above it that slightly appealed to me more, but overall I thought Dust Breeding was really good. This is sort of in the list where it starts to get difficult to rank them, because they're all pretty close together. But yeah, Dust Breeding is fantastic. I wouldn't consider it to be an all-time classic necessarily, but I do think it's a very good story. Very solid. Number 26, The Shadow of the Scourge. This one obviously is written by Paul Cornell, who has written some of my favourite stories. This one is really good. It's all set in this sort of hotel, and it has the 7th Doctor Ace and Benny Summerfield. I believe this is the first appearance of Benny on Big Finish, and it is really good. I really like this one. And it's so interesting, the whole thing of dead bodies come back to life. It's very thematically strong and works well with, sort of working with character and with intertwining with the plot, as Cornell often does in his stories. Though I will say, I do think compared to other Cornells, this one doesn't quite click with me as much as the others, but it is still a really solid story with some really cool stuff. And I just think maybe it gets a little bit too cheesy for my liking at some points. Specifically with Ace, I don't quite know how to put my finger on it, but there's just something about it that I can't quite get into, and I don't know what it is, but I still think it's a really good story, really solid, and the stuff that's strong in it is very, very strong. Number 25, The Fearmonger. It's the first Big Finish story in release order that I would consider to be great. It's very captivating, and one thing that I really like about it is the danger that Ace is put in here, and it has a really interesting plot and some quite heavy, strong political ideas and themes in it. And I think that, considering that it goes all in on that, it's a risky move, but in doing so, I think it executes it in a way that's really well done. And I think that The Fearmonger overall, it really does a good job in that regard. I do think that there is something to be said about, comparatively to some other stories in this list, it's not quite to my taste compared to some others, but in execution it is so good that it ends up this high on the list, I believe. So overall, I would give praise to The Fearmonger, and there's some really powerful, quite dramatic parts of the story that I really like. And yeah, it's a really good story. Really good story. Number 24, The Genocide Machine. This is the 7th Doctor section of the Dalek Empire quadrilogy, and is my favourite of the 4. I will admit that this story isn't very complex. However, the premise of it being the library, which is interestingly very similar to Silence in the Library Forest of the Dead, except obviously not with the Vashta Nerada, but there is this library that has a lot of power and information in it, and I kind of have this headcanon that after this period in time where there was this library that was a power on this planet, this information was then transferred to in the future where it became an entire planet in Silence in the Library. Having said that, I really like the whole plot around this library and how the Daleks are planning to seize power of the library for their needs in the Dalek Empire, and I really like that. And the way the plot plays out, it kind of plays off all the different classic tropes you see in all the different Dalek stories. It's got duplicates, it's got the action scenes you'd expect, and overall I would say that The Genocide Machine it's kind of just that fun Dalek story that I really enjoy. It's very fundamental, it's very, cliched and derivative of other Dalek stories, but in a way that I really, really, really enjoyed. And this was just a very entertaining listen for me. One that I just had a really soft spot for, and again, like I said, it's not as complex as some of these other stories. Like something like The Fearmonger, which I've ranked below it. It's a much more complex plot, much more, well-written plot, but this one for me was just very enjoyable, and it was like comfort food for my ears. I was so engaged, and I had so much fun with The Genocide Machine, so that's why I'm going to give it this praise. Number 23, Flip Flop. This one has the gimmick of being a story that you can listen to in different ways, as it has on the CD 2 different discs, one called White, one called Black, and ultimately you can listen to this story in multiple orders. You could either listen to White first and then Black, or you can listen to Black first and then White, and you'll get different perspectives in the story and it'll pay off in different ways, which is a really creative gimmick for a story, I would say. It's a really interesting experiment to play with. I personally, when I listened to it, I listened to White first and then Black, and I thought it was very interesting. It's, again, like the plot, it doesn't actually go into massive complexity within itself, And one of the reasons for this is because it has to keep a fairly understandable bit of continuity so that the audience doesn't get confused. But by doing so, by splitting different elements of the plot across white and black, you get missing pieces in white that then pay off in black, or there's missing pieces in black that pay off in white. And I would say because it doesn't have the massively complex plot and essentially has to take place across 50 minutes of story time, again, that are expressed over 4 episodes that take place all at the same time, in terms of the white and black taking place parallel, it doesn't have the longest plot because of that. However, where they connect and where they link up and where you missing information in one leads to connections in the other is really cool. I think it's a really neat concept for a story and really interesting. A really interesting way to play with time travel, the fact that the 7th Doctor and Mel split off and there's 2 versions of each in the same story doing different things and they all affect each other. It's quite interesting, really. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. Again, not the best story ever, and I think the gimmick holds it back slightly in the sense that it can't be too complex. I would be interested to see if they did a story like this again, but much bigger and more ambitious, if they could even pull that off. But I think it's really unique, and I think it deserves praise for being an interesting concept at the very least, and I enjoyed it. I think overall it was fairly enjoyable, so I'll give it that. Number 22, Blood Tide. I think my favourite thing about this story is the fact that it does a Silurian story that isn't just a copy of Doctor Who and the Silurians. Hello, Hungry Earth and Cold Blood. But I really do like this one. The Silurians are ruthless in this, and they're really dark in this. And I love the soundscape of the whole the water with the boat and the blood, and overall the Silurian voices are great in this. And again, 6th Doctor and Evelyn are one of the best pairings on Big Finish for me. I love them together. They just work so well. She is such a great foil for him, and he is such a great support for her, and it's fantastic. And overall, this is a bloodthirsty Silurian story, and it's got a really, really captivating plot, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really solid, really enjoyable story. And the Silurians are fantastic, and it's a lovely way to just sort of bring across again a Silurian story that isn't the same story again. It's different. It's a different kind of Silurian story, which was refreshing, which is really good, and it was needed, I think. So, overall, Blood Tide is a very good story for me. So that's why it ends up at number 22. Number 21, The Fires of Vulcan. Everyone says that this is the story that saved Mel Bush as a character. In a lot of ways it did. She really came into her own in this. But for any of those who've seen The Fires of Pompeii, this story is kind of the originator, and Fires of Pompeii borrowed a lot of stuff from Fires of Vulcan. However, the plots are still quite different, though one big similarity that they do have is the fact that the TARDIS goes missing at the start, and they have to find it again. But it is done in a slightly different way. And I think that The Fires of Vulcan is a lot less... It's not as emotional for me as The Fires of Pompeii. It doesn't have that big gut punch like The Fires of Pompeii has. But I will leave Fires of Pompeii to the side and speak about Fires of Vulcan as its own story. Really well plotted. The soundscape's really good. There's a really nice scene with the 7th Doctor and Mel that had just... The acting from Sylvester McCoy and Bonnie Langford in this is actually really, really good. And I thought that overall, The Fires of Vulcan really showed what this TARDIS team could be like if they did a more serious plot. And it was really refreshing considering, very different to season 24. And yeah, The Fires of Vulcan is very good. The plot's very interesting. The whole setting is great. And it has a lot of the things that people like about Fires of Pompeii are in this story as well. But it's different enough to be its own thing, which is good. So yeah, overall, Fires of Vulcan is a thumbs up. Very good story. Number 20. The Stones of Venice. This one is a really interesting story. In fact, it was originally written with the 4th Doctor and Romana in mind. That being Romana 2. However, it is given to the 8th Doctor and Charlie, and I still think it works really well for them. And I think one thing that's really interesting is it's functioned like a historical in Venice, but it's in the future. And I really like the whole idea of, everyone knows about how Venice is, if the water rises, that it will flood Venice. But in this future, Venice has evolved to where water travel is how you get around. And I just really like that whole premise of it. The soundscape's great, the whole atmosphere of it's very entertaining, and it's, in a ways, it's subtly quite a romantic story for the 8th Doctor and Charlie as well, especially being their 3rd adventure. And overall, I just thought The Stones of Venice was a really solid story. There's things that The Vampires of Venice definitely borrows from this, but doesn't do anywhere near as well, in my opinion. But this one, overall, I thought was really good. I really like The Stones of Venice. And there's not a lot more that I can say about it other than that. I think it's just really, really good. And yeah. Number 19. The Spectre of Lanyon Moor. This one features the Sixth Doctor and Evelyn and the Brigadier. And unlike Minuet in Hell, this one actually uses the Brigadier pretty well. And I just found this one so much fun to listen to. It may not be the most complex and the best plot ever, and the villain plot at the very end may not be as satisfying of an ending as you'd think, but the whole setting, the soundscape, the actors, just the whole chemistry between and all the characters is just... I just really enjoyed it. And it had a nice scale to it, but the biggest thing for me is the Sixth Doctor and Evelyn together, and the Brigadier are just... oh, they're just perfect. And that, for me, this is a very big character development episode for the Sixth Doctor and Evelyn, just moving again towards her being the foil to him. Works really well, especially there's a specific scene in this story where he's an asshole, and she just snaps at him, but in the best way possible, you know, telling him to behave, and I just love it. I absolutely love it. And Colin Baker and the Brigadier. Sixth Doctor and Brigadier have such good chemistry. And I really enjoy this story. It's a lot of fun. I admit it's not the best story ever. It's not a classic, but I rank it really highly because my enjoyment of it is just so good that I'm willing to put it higher than maybe it should deserve. Number 18. Zagreus. Obviously, this is the 40th anniversary story for Doctor Who in Big Finish, and it is one that features Peter Davison, Colin Baker, Sylvester McCoy, and Paul McGann. Funnily enough, not really playing any of their Doctors, which is fascinating, and in fact, most of the actors in this don't actually play their own characters. It's bizarre, but what I love about it is that the 5th, 6th, and 7th Doctors, they all play almost like stereotypical criticisms of their Doctors in a lot of ways, in the fact that, like, the 5th Doctor is so aggressively boring, and the 6th Doctor is so aggressively rude, and the 7th Doctor is a clown at a carnival, and it's just so much fun, and hearing all of these different actors that have been throughout the entire of the main range and who've appeared in the TV show all come together to just act out these weird characters is so fascinating. But then, of course, that all culminates with the 8th Doctor being possessed by Zagreus, and Charlie, India Fisher, really carrying the whole story, I think, on her back. And you've got, obviously, the Brigadier of the TARDIS, and a little cameo from John Pertwee in Devious as well. And then, obviously, the big bad being Don Warrington as Rassilon, as part of the whole Gallifrey story in that, with Romana as well. And I just think that it makes for a really fun, fitting 40th anniversary story. It's really weird and experimental, as you'd expect from Big Finish. And overall, I just think it's a really enjoyable story. 4 hours is massive, yet somehow it's still really entertaining. So I think it kind of earns that length in a way. And I can see why modern people of the show might look at it Zagreus and not like it, because of it sort of being like, you need to have listened and understand all this continuity to get it. But that is kind of the point. The whole point of when Zagreus came out is that the people that would have been listening to it would know the context of it all, and it's designed to be fan service in that way. And as fan service, I think it really works. And I really like the way it ends and the way it leads into Scherzo as well. I think Zagreus is a really good story, really fun 40th anniversary, something really different. It's completely different from any other multi-Doctor story, I feel. And yeah, just a really interesting one. And overall, I don't think it deserves any of the hate it gets, to be honest. And I think it's really good. Not top tier, but considering for what it is, I think it achieves what it wants. And I don't know if that's controversial to say, but honestly, I think it's really good. Number 17, Omega. The first story in the Villains trilogy. This one obviously featuring the 5th Doctor and Omega, and in a lot of ways it is a sequel to Arc of Infinity, and it's also one of the rare stories where you don't see the 5th Doctor with a companion, because he's with a companion for all of his TV run, and he's with a companion for most of his audios, but in this one he is by himself, and it is a really, really good story, and I can't really give the game away. This story has a very specific plot twist, and if I reveal it, it will spoil the whole story. So I can't tell you what that is, but all I can say is that this story is a really, really good story studying the Fifth Doctor and Omega, and it really fixes a lot of the damage done in Arc Infinity, and overall it is fantastic, and it has one of my favourite twists in all of Doctor Who, and you have to listen to it to understand it. I just want to protect people from that twist. I don't want to talk about it, but man, it's so good. It's so good, and I'm just going to leave it at that. Omega is fantastic. Number 17. There we go. Number 16, Project Twilight. The first story for The Forge. They are a collection of vampires, and again, vampires are a big part of Doctor Who lore, especially set up by Terrance Dixon's State of Decay, as the vampires and the Time Lords have a history of battles together. But The Forge here is great. The plot's great, the characters are great, the setting's great, the soundscape's great. It's just a fantastic story. I love the whole setting, I love the plot, and I love the way it revolves around this casino, and you think that it's going to be this sort of American-style casino film with, a gang mafia behind it, but then it reveals itself, and it's such a fascinating story, and such a fascinating setup for the Forge to come in the future. And again, like the Sixth Doctor and Evelyn are fantastic in this story, and overall it is just awesome. I love Project Twilight. It's a great story, and it only set up even more to come, which we'll get onto. Now we really get to the top tier. Number 15 is Doctor Who and the Pirates, which is a great story. It's such an interesting mix that you wouldn't think would work together. But it is a Sixth Doctor and Evelyn story, and they are fantastic in it. And it's a musical on a pirate ship, but that musical is interpreted by the way that Evelyn tells a young girl a story about them meeting pirates. And the entire of episode 3, we get Colin Baker singing along, and it's just, it's so good. I love it. It's hilarious. The story has so much great comedy in it. It's such a cheerful musical pirate story. But the fact that whole musical is just a way for Evelyn to try and cheer up someone who is feeling suicidal is really deep and meaningful. In the fact that Evelyn, through telling this story to this person who is suicidal, helps save this person's life is quite powerful. And yeah, Doctor and the Pirates is fantastic and very emotional, and a great story for Evelyn, and showing the kind of power she has to do good and save people. And it's just it's lovely. It's a lovely story, full of laughter, full of emotion. It's great. Doctor and the Pirates is excellent. Number 14, Seasons of Fear. This is an 8th Doctor story that kind of functions a bit like the Keys of Marinus, where in each episode they go to a different location. But I love the way the plot unfolds. I love the way that the plot is set up almost time-wise in reverse, where the man at the end of his journey sees the Doctor at the start of it here. And I love the way how the Doctor sees him in the past, thinking that he's going to be doing something involved with him that he was told to do, but then inadvertently causes this man to become evil. The Doctor himself, again I'll repeat, the Doctor inadvertently causes an innocent, fine man to become evil across time. And I love that as a plot. I love that, using that to create a plot across time and going to these different locations as you see this man's character develop because of the Doctor's actions. Also, the Nymon are in it, so that's great too. But yeah, it's a really great story. Really great story. Again, it goes off the whole experimental nature of the 8th Doctor range with Charlie, and I love it. Seasons of Fear is a classic. It's a fantastic story, and it's just so creative. Number 13, The Marian Conspiracy. Oh, I love this one. This is when the Sixth Doctor first meets Evelyn Smythe, who in my opinion is his best companion, and they have such good chemistry together. This plot revolving around her being a history teacher and then them having to go back into history to save Evelyn, and then him meeting the Queen of England, and then that whole plot around what Evelyn Smythe was teaching and studying in history becomes part of the history. And I love that. I love that, and how she becomes directly involved in these events that she's interested in. It's a really nice way to sort of set up the history teacher becoming part of the plot. And Evelyn and the Doctor have such good chemistry together, and I just love them. I love them together. And the plot's great, and the whole conspiracy around it is great. It's just your fundamental historical story that's revolved around an interesting event that unfolds, and the plot becomes part of the history, and the history becomes part of the plot. And it's just, oh, I love it. It's such a great way to start off Evelyn and the Sixth Doctor's time together. And honestly, I think some of the early first few Big Finishes can be a little bit rough going, but if I really wanted to start someone off hot with Big Finish, I think the Marian Conspiracy is a good way to go. I think the Marian Conspiracy is a really good way to start off a Big Finish listener, because it's just so good, so captivating, so enjoyable, so interesting. Plot's moving, the plot's great, and the characters are great, and it's just, fantastic. My number 12 is another great starting point, and that is Storm Warning, which is the first 8th Doctor story where he meets Charlie Pollard in 1930. And one thing I really like about it is that they took the 8th Doctor from the TV movie and transitioned him right into this story, so it's as if it's the same character. And then they used this as a launching pad to then develop him as he changes, which is fantastic. He's so upbeat, so fun, and Paul McGann and India Fisher have such great chemistry, and I love the whole plot. I love the way that Charlie was meant to die in this crash, and the 8th Doctor, he saves her life, changes history, and she becomes alive because of him, and that starts off their arc. And the character's fantastic. I love the plot. It's just so captivating, so entertaining. And again, like the Marian Conspiracy, this could be a great starting point for someone who's getting into Big Finish, and it's just the way to start off the 8th Doctor era in Big Finish. And I just, it's so good, so much fun, such great character work with the two of them, and I just love it. Number 11, Project Lazarus. Obviously, this is a sequel to Project Twilight, as it features the Forge again, but not only this is a multi-Doctor story with a 6th and 7th Doctor, but in my opinion is one of the most unique and one of the best multi-Doctor stories we've ever had, with the first 2 episodes being a story with the 6th Doctor and Evelyn Smythe, and for me being the most emotional and heart-tearing moment in Big Finish I've had so far. Possibly. Well, I mean, Scherzo definitely got there, but Project Lazarus, with what happens at the end of episode 2, I don't want to spoil it necessarily, especially coming off Doctor and the Pirates. It's a really good way to follow that story up. But the way that Evelyn and the 6th Doctor, they clash because of the tragedy of what happens at the end of episode 2, and just how the 6th Doctor just feels so emotional, so sad about it, and how Evelyn Smythe is so upset, and it's just some of the best acting in Big Finish from Colin Baker and Maggie Stables in this story. It's so good. The 6th Doctor section of this is so powerful, so emotional, and such a great sequel to Project Twilight, and it's heartbreaking. And then that massive pin drops, and right after that you hear the 7th Doctor's theme come in, and then you get the 7th Doctor half of the story, which is horrifying. It's dark, messed up, and the 7th Doctor is near the end of his life, and you get this copy of Colin Baker, who's not the Doctor, but he is this clone of him that is dying, and it's so messed up, and it's so gruesome, and it just left me on such a dark note. And Project Lazarus is a classic. It's such a good story. It's a powerful story. It's hard-hitting, The way it utilizes the two halves of the story for the 6th and 7th Doctor is fantastic. And it is just... oh, it's amazing. It's an amazing Big Finish audio. So good. And I do think you do have to listen to the 6th Doctor and Evelyn stories up to that point to really let it sink in. Maybe skip the Sandman, but you really do have to listen to the 6th Doctor and Evelyn's character arc build up to that point, especially Doctor and the Pirates, and especially, or obviously have to listen to Project Twilight as well, as this is a sequel to that, and you do obviously have to have some context of the 7th Doctor, but if you do, it's just... Project Lazarus. Brilliant. Brilliant story. And now we get to the top 10. Number 10 is Colditz, a 7th Doctor and Ace story in Nazi Germany inside Colditz Castle. This one has 2 plots in it, and they are great, and one of them, which is the Ace plot, features a Nazi who is played by David Tennant, and he is so good in it, as you'd expect. And oh boy, the scene that he has with McCoy, oh, I love the scenes that he has with McCoy, and his demise at the end of the story is so messed up. It was gruesome. And you get a great story with the Doctor and a great time travel story as well. And I just love the way that the 2 plots, they are separate from each other, but they take place within the same story, and so good. Both of them, both plots in this story are fantastic. It's just an all-round brilliant story. I love Colditz, especially for the 7th Doctor and Ace's characters, and I highly recommend you all listen to it. It's just fantastic. I mean, David Tennant fans out there, he's in this story as the villain, as one of the villains at least of the Ace plot, and it's just, oh, I love it, Colditz. It's brutal, it's nasty, it's fantastic. It's exactly what I expect from a Nazi story. Much better than Let's Go Hitler. But yeah, fantastic. Colditz is my number 10. Number 9, Neverland. This is the 8th Doctor and Charlie story that leads into Zagreus. And it's really, really interesting. Really creative. And I think not only is McGann and Charlie great in it, especially Charlie. The fact that she sees him getting taken over by Zagreus and she has to go through that, but also for Romana, especially Lalla Ward, is fantastic in this, and it makes for a fantastic Gallifrey story and a great lead-in to Zagreus. But for me, the biggest thing for me I love about this story is Don Warrington as Rassilon. Oh, he's so good, and there's some really creative ways they go about the story, and the way that it really plays with us some abstract ideas, especially Gallifreyan abstract ideas. And I just think it's definitely one of the strongest Gallifreyan stories we've had. And it just, again, it just embodies the whole 8 and Charlie era. And just the whole experimental nature of it is one of the pinnacle examples of it. And just the character work is fantastic and the plot's great. And it's fantastic start to end. It's so good. Such a great lead and such a good story. I absolutely love it, and that's why it's at my number 9. Number 8, The Rapture. Follow-up to Colditz. This one, especially for Ace and the Doctor's characters, this one is a story that is so experimental because it revolves around radio and music, and even the cover itself is like a music album. And I love the way it's made. I love the way sound is used to create the story. I love the way it uses Ace and the 7th Doctor as characters, especially with Ace. She wants a break from it all. She just wants to live. She wants to be young. And it ties into the whole thing of, drugs and partying and being yourself. And I love the way that this ties into, again, Ace's backstory. She meets a brother she didn't know she had. And that's great, and the way it intercuts dialogue between different scenes, but it all thematically fits together, is brilliant. The villain plot's great with the drugs and all that, just feeding off the whole young people's minds, the way the 7th Doctor wraps his head around that, and again, the whole premise of the radio, and just music, and partying, and that using that as part of the story, and just, it's so well edited, so creative, so fun to listen to, and it's so powerful character-wise, emotionally, and performances are fantastic. fantastic. And it just wraps up in a great way. I love The Rapture. I think it's an absolute gem of a story. Absolute bloody gem of a story. It's so good. Number 7, Spare Parts. As you all probably know, Spare Parts is essentially the genesis of the Cybermen, considering that Terry Nation did genesis of the Daleks on TV. Mark Platt did that with the Cybermen, specifically with the Mondasian Cybermen, and it's famous. It's one of the most famous Big Finish stories. Most Doctor Who fans know about Spare Parts, and even 2 New Who stories have been derived off it. Rise of the Cybermen, Age of Steel, and World Enough in Time have borrowed a lot of things from Spare Parts and used them in their stories. And it's such a brilliant Cyberman story. It really captures the horror element of it, but not just that, the characters within the world of Mondas are fantastic as well, especially with the 5th Doctor and Nissa being one of the more tender and vulnerable and harmless Doctor companion dynamics. They are a lot softer than some of the others, and I think that putting them in this harsh environment of Mondas with these Cybermen and just the horror element of it is really smart, and just overall it's fantastic. It's a masterpiece. Mark Platt did a brilliant job, and oh god, it's got one of the best and most horrifying executions of doing the Cybermen that there's ever been in Doctor Who, and it is the bona fide classic that everyone says it is. It deserves the praise it gets. It's just, Spare Parts is awesome. Number 6, Davros. Second installment in the Villains trilogy. We get a 6th Doctor story with Davros, and it's unbelievable. I love this story. I believe Dylan, aka Lord Slart's, his favourite Doctor Who story of all time, and I can see why. The fact that it's given that the Doctor and Davros have to work together in this story, and there's no companion, like the other stories in the Villains trilogy. There's no companion, so it can put a full focus on the Doctor and his relationship with the villain. And the relationship between the Doctor and Davros in the story is incredible, and I just love the way that Davros gives parts of his backstory to us and uses that to create the story. And that whole scene of him talking about on Skaro when he held up his hand and he could see the bones in his hand. I love that whole scene, and the way his eyes were burnt out by a Thal isotope. Yes, Stephen Moffat, they were burnt out. And then also the fact that in the place that they're in the story, that Davros is giving, despite the fact that he is so corrupt, he is giving his critique of the politics in this world. It's so fascinating to get psychology of such a messed up man, such an authority, such a almost Nazi-like character that we all know, and to get that full development, that full just sinking in of all the facets of Davros and just everything about his character and how his relationship works with the Doctor is just magnificent. It's a must listen. It is such a great character piece for Davros and the Doctor. I absolutely love it. It's brilliant. Number 5, Creatures of Beauty. So Nick Briggs is known for doing quite standard stories. He's also known for doing a lot of fan service, and I find a lot of his stories to not be particularly great, but somewhere inside he managed to pull out this absolute gem of a story. Creatures of Beauty is unbelievable. It is one of my absolute favourite 5th Doctor stories, probably second behind Caves of Androzani. The way that it plays all out of sync with time, the way that you experience the story out of order, I just love that. And the way that it portrays the 5th Doctor, who is playing a sort of pacifist centrist in the whole scenario, seeing, well, I can see that point of view, I can see that point of view. And with the 5th Doctor and Nissa being, again, that tender Doctor-companion relationship are perfect for the story. And the way that the whole plot revolves around beauty, around what is considered beauty, and the fact that it uses oxymorons and antonyms of beauty to really showcase what it's like if everything we thought about beauty was reversed or changed, and the fact that there's a massive twist at the end of the story to just round off the whole thing. It's so good, it's so creative, it's so captivating in the way that it tells events out of order, a bit like a Quentin Tarantino film, revealing things to the audience in a very specific storytelling way is so powerful. And it's just, it's exquisite. Everything about Creatures of Beauty is just unbelievable, start to finish. I love it. I absolutely love it. Masterpiece of a story. Number 4, and now we get to Robert Shearman territory. My number 4 is Jubilee. As you all know, Jubilee is the story that was inspired Dalek in the TV show. However, it is its own story. Jubilee is one of the darkest Doctor Who stories of all time. It's just, when you listen to it, you just have this constant sense of dread, and it just makes you so depressed and down. And I think it's genius. I love the characters. I love the way that this husband and wife who are so corrupt lie to each other, hate each other, and the way that the Dalek has become this icon after they won an invasion, and the way that the Sixth Doctor and Evelyn Smythe in the story, again, just adding more brilliance to it. They have to change time to fix it, and it's genius. It's absolute genius by Rob Shearman, and it's a brilliant twist in it as well when the Doctor hears about this man in a wheelchair, and you all think it's Davros, but then it's revealed who it really is, and I don't want to spoil it, but it's so good. Characters are brilliant, plot's brilliant, everything about it is exquisite, and it's so dark, so messed up, so brilliant. I love it. I love Jubilee. It's so good. It's one of the best Doctor Who stories, I think, ever done, and I think it stands as a separate piece of media to Dalek, because Dalek's very much its own thing, and Jubilee's its own thing, and they're both excellent. And Rob Shearman's just a genius. It's incredible. Jubilee is my number 4. It's just so good. Number 3, Master. The third installment in the Villains trilogy, with the 7th Doctor and Geoffrey Beevers as the Master. But not just the Master, to John Smith, like in Human Nature with the Doctor. And it is 4 episodes of character drama. Character drama at its absolute finest. Everyone in the story is so grey, so questionable, so messed up, but it's so brilliant. It's such a perfect story for the 7th Doctor, and I honestly, for me, it is the best 7th Doctor story there is, and I believe that it is the last story that he has before the TV movie, before he regenerates, because it is just such a perfect story for him, and Geoffrey Beevers and Sylvester McCoy give some of the best performances we've ever had, and overall, this is probably, for my money, the best story for the Master in Doctor Who. Probably. As much as I love Utopia, Sound of Drums, Last of Time Lords, and Frontier in Space, and a bunch of others, this one is just, it's off the charts. It's perfect. And the usage of death from the VNAs, who was an eternal like they are in Enlightenment, is just a perfect, again, villain for the story. And the whole backstory behind the Doctor and the Master as children is the reason why the Doctor and the Master are the way they are. It's such a brilliant backstory for them. And it's just, I love it. I love Master. It is a masterpiece by Joseph Lidster. Everything about it's perfect. It is just exquisite Doctor Who. I love it. It is a must listen. Number 2, The Holy Terror. Adam and I have reviewed this on the channel. Again, Rob Shearman, his genius. It's just, sometimes I'm just so taken aback by it. I'm so taken aback by how brilliant this man is at writing Doctor Who. Everything about this story is utterly perfect. It is such a brilliant story around the whole concept of religion. And it sets up this world where it not only is taking off the tropes of religion, but it does it in such a dark, funny, humorous way. And the whole things of tradition and monarchy, and I love the characters, and I love the way that these traditions, these harsh traditions, rather than being a dramatic point, they're an inconvenience, such as, you know, a mother saying to a child, oh, giving birth to you was such a hassle because it spoiled my figure. You know, it's just such a playing off the dark and messed up minds that humans have, you know, on the inside, of the truths that we don't tell people. It's really nasty, and it really exposes so many flaws with tradition and religion, but does it in such a respectful and clever way, to not be heavy-handed. It's just done in this brilliant plot, and I love the twists. I love how it's subversive in the best way possible, and the whole thing is brilliant. And it's got the Sixth Doctor and Frobisher in it, and Frobisher, you would be like, he's a talking penguin, surely this won't work. No, it works, and it works brilliantly, and I just love it. Perfect Doctor Who, so good on every level, must listen, unbelievable. Go watch our review of it. Number 1. It's a cliche, but it's The Chimes of Midnight. The most famous Big Finish story, the most popular Big Finish story, Robert Shearman's classic. It's number 1 of the main range for me, and it's my second favourite Big Finish, just behind Scherzo. I mean, what can I say? Everyone who's listened to The Chimes of Midnight knows why it's so popular, and it's just the pinnacle of Rob Shearman. It's exactly the kind of thing that he writes, and what we love about his style, and oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. The Eighth Doctor and Charlie are great in it. It's some of their best performances and characterizations. The whole concept of the house and time, and how it reverts itself, and how it plays, and how it's a murder mystery, but each time that time resets itself, it's slightly different, and how the plot is all these different Doctor Who stories you've seen before, but each time you think it's going to be one, it's not, and it's the other. And then the whole thing of it being a Christmas-inspired story, and how, despite the fact that it's so dark and so messed up, it ends on this brilliantly earned, uplifting note. It's one of the few times that I find that the happy Christmas ending works to its full effect. I find it so well earned, and just everything about Chimes of Midnight from start to finish is utter genius. Utter genius. From the direction, the sound design, the score, the acting, the writing, the characters, the plot, and just these small little moments, the humor, it's utterly, utterly divine. One of the best Doctor Who stories of all time, The Chimes of Midnight, deserving at number 1 of the 1 to 50 main range for me. Beautiful. Whew, and that was my ranking of the Big Finish main range 1 to 50. Let me know in the comments or on Twitter what you think of my list. I know that obviously there's going to be some controversial picks in there. Let me know what you think of these stories. I hope that this, for some of you who haven't heard much Big Finish, this has given you an indication of what you can listen to and what you can look forward to. And I do believe that 1 to 50 main range is a very, very strong period in Doctor Who. It's one of the best even. It's one of the best eras of Doctor Who I think there's ever been creatively. And I think it's fantastic. And I'm glad that I got to do this ranking. And I'm glad that I've listened to them all now. And yeah, I don't think we've talked enough about Big Finish on this channel that much, so I think it's cool that I'm doing this and sort of getting out my thoughts on a whole bunch of Big Finish stories. But yeah, because it's truly special. It's a great period for the show in audio form. And there's just some utter classics on here. And admittedly, there's a bit of shit as well. But that's okay. So, thank you for watching, and we will see you all tomorrow for day 5.